The courtroom laughed. Not loudly, just sharp chuckles from the polished men behind my father. Even the bailiff hid a smile. My father stood at the plaintiff's table, resting his hand on the walnut as if he already owned the room. Your Honor, his voice was smooth. My daughter can barely pay rent, yet she expects to control a $65 million estate. People laughed openly. Then I stood. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't tremble. I didn't flush with embarrassment. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I walked past the mahogany divider and approached the bench. I am not asking to control my grandmother Eleanor's estate, Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the fading laughter like a scalpel. I am informing the court that the Department of Justice has officially initiated a federal seizure of these assets based on my forensic evidence. I am informing the court that the Department of Justice has issued an emergency freeze on these assets. I have provided the court clerk with the verified federal seal and the accompanying documentation for your immediate review and authentication. The laughter died instantly. The silence that replaced it was heavy, suffocating. The judge frowned, breaking the seal and scanning the first page. His posture went rigid. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by absolute lethal seriousness. He looked up at my father, then down at the federal credentials bearing my name. My father's confident grin slipped. For a decade, I had been trained to view my family's demands as unpayable debt. That was the invisible chain of the survivor. I had been taught that family loyalty was a binding contract, a prison without bars, where I was required to be the perpetual debtor. They conditioned me to believe that my worth was tied entirely to my usefulness to them. It is a psychological trap, a learned helplessness, masked as duty, designed to keep the victim functioning as a tireless engine for their abusers. But chains only work if you believe you cannot break them. And my belief had shattered exactly 48 hours ago. I remembered sitting in my cramped apartment at 2 a.m. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the room. I had been meticulously tracking the paper trail of my father's greed. Richard had always been careless, assuming his authority shielded him from scrutiny. He left digital fingerprints everywhere. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I was a forensic accountant, and I was finally auditing my own life. Eleanor, the matriarch who actually built the company, had known exactly what my father was. Before she passed, she didn't just leave me the estate. She left me the legal authority to dismantle his fraud. The federal receivership meant I bypassed probate completely. The court didn't need to decide if I was fit to inherit. The federal government had already deputized me to seize the assets, freeze the accounts, and investigate the discrepancies. I watched my father exchange a panicked glance with his wife, Vanessa. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the federal seal. "This court recognizes the federal receivership," he announced, his voice echoing in the dead quiet room. "All civil proceedings regarding the estate are hereby suspended. The jurisdiction has shifted. The atmosphere in the room shifted from mockery to raw terror. The men in tailored suits stopped breathing. My father's hand dropped from the walnut table. The business transaction of our family had just been audited, and I was here to collect. For years, I had been the shadow accountant. I was the silent investor in their version of family, funding a lifestyle I was never invited to enjoy. While Vanessa hosted charity galas in $10,000 dresses and Richard expanded his executive portfolio, I was the one working late into the night, untangling their financial messes. They would bring me their chaotic ledgers, the unexplained deficits, the massive over-leveraging, and they would demand that I fix it. I was the one who found the tax loopholes. I was the one who reclassified their reckless spending to keep the board of directors pacified. Now, I realized their affection had been a subscription with me footing the bill. Whenever Richard made a bad investment, a speculative real estate deal that crashed, or a luxury purchase he couldn't justify, he came to me. He never asked. He commanded. I was forced to take out personal loans in my name to cover the margins. He promised he would pay me back, citing familial duty and the eventual inheritance. I had accumulated over $100,000 in personal debt just to keep his ventures afloat. I drove a 10-year-old sedan and lived in a studio apartment while my father leased a private jet. I was the engine of a machine meant to destroy me. I processed the numbers, balanced the books, and ensured Richard looked like a visionary CEO. But the truth was, his entire empire was built on a foundation of systemic fraud and my silent complicity. I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just saved them from ruin one more time, they would finally see me as a daughter. They would finally offer me a seat at the table. But the balance sheet never lied. Every dollar I poured into them was a negative return on investment. The turning point wasn't an emotional breakdown, it was a simple realization of mathematics. A machine cannot run if you cut the fuel supply. Eleanor had seen it. She had watched from her hospital bed as Richard bled her legacy dry and used me as the tourniquet. When she secretly contacted me 3 months before her death, she didn't offer apologies. She offered documents, she showed me the hidden accounts, the offshore transfers, the truth of my father's operations. She had legally amended her trust and power of attorney documents specifically to grant me, as a forensic accountant, the authority to audit her estate and report any discrepancies directly to the federal authorities upon her passing. "You are the only one who knows how the numbers work, Maya," she had told me. "You built the walls to protect him. Now, you must tear them down." So I did. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my laptop and started clicking cancel. I traced every fraudulent wire transfer, every shell corporation, every forced loan. I compiled the evidence with clinical precision. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I documented the systematic financial abuse, handed the portfolio to the federal authorities, and secured the receivership. I wasn't the shadow accountant anymore. I was the auditor. And the audit was ruthless. The ledger was finally being balanced, and the debt they owed was catastrophic. My father refused to fold. Richard was a man who believed his own lies, a CEO who thought reality bent to his will if he simply spoke loudly enough. He slammed his hand flat against the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he barked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "My daughter is unwell. She has a history of instability. This is a mental break, a desperate cry for attention." Beside him, Vanessa immediately pulled out her phone. She angled the camera toward me, recording the scene. She leaned into her role, playing the concerned, victimized stepmother perfectly. "We've tried to get her help, Your Honor," Vanessa said, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "Maya has been spiraling since Eleanor passed. She stole those documents from Richard's private office. They are manipulated, forged. She's completely delusional. We just want her to get psychiatric care." I watched them perform. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. A few months ago, their coordinated attack would have sent me into a panic. I would have stumbled over my words, desperately trying to prove my sanity, trying to beg for the judge's belief. But today, I felt nothing but a cold, analytical detachment. Let them speak. Let them escalate. Every word they recorded, every lie they told the judge, was just another line item on their final invoice. I stood perfectly still, my expression blank, my posture relaxed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just waited for them to dig their own graves. "Your Honor, I demand that those documents be impounded and verified by an independent investigator," Richard demanded, adjusting his silk tie. "She cannot possibly be a federal receiver. She is a 24-year-old girl who can't even manage her own credit card debt. Debt that you forced me to take out, I thought, but kept my mouth shut." The judge looked from Richard's red, furious face to my completely calm demeanor. The contrast was damning. "Mr. Henderson," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone, "I have the United States federal seal in front of me. I have the signature of a federal district judge. Are you accusing the federal government of forgery, or are you simply committing perjury in my courtroom?" "Mr. Henderson, I have a federal warrant here, verified and stamped by the district court authorizing the immediate intervention in your estate's management. Unless you want to add contempt of court to your list of federal charges, I suggest you stay silent. Richard faltered. He opened his mouth, but the arrogant words died in his throat. Vanessa lowered her phone, the realization slowly dawning on her that they were not controlling the narrative. They were trapped in it. They had expected a hysterical girl. They had expected an emotional outburst that they could point to as proof of my instability. Instead, they faced a brick wall of federal authority and clinical silence. I looked directly at my father. He wasn't looking at a daughter anymore. He was looking at an executioner. I had one more folder in my briefcase. The final audit, the piece of evidence that would shift this from a civil dispute over a grandmother's will into an inescapable criminal prosecution. The escalation of their hostility had only justified the severity of my response. They had tried to paint me as insane to protect their theft. Now, it was time to show them exactly how sane I was. I unclasped the brass locks of my briefcase. The click echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. I withdrew a slim, red folder and handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear. As the acting federal receiver, my first duty was to secure the company's employee benefits network. That folder contains the pension restructuring file. The judge opened the red folder. As he read, the color physically drained from his face. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I didn't need to look at the pages. I had memorized the numbers. For 3 years, Richard and Vanessa had systematically drained the employee pension fund. They had set up a complex web of shell companies, disguised as high-yield offshore investments. But the money never went to investments. It went to Vanessa's luxury real estate acquisitions in Dubai. It went to Richard's private aviation leases. It went to their personal offshore trusts. They had stolen $22.8 million from the retirement savings of 300 hardworking employees. People who had trusted my father for decades. People who were planning to retire next year, unaware that their accounts were empty. "Mr. Henderson," the judge whispered. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal weight. "This documentation shows authorized transfers from the union pension accounts directly into private LLCs managed by your wife." Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "Your Honor, those were approved alternative investment vehicles. The market fluctuates. We were simply diversifying the portfolio." The judge slammed the folder shut. "Diversifying? You transferred $22.8 million into a holding company registered to Vanessa Henderson, which then purchased a luxury asset. That is not a market fluctuation, Mr. Henderson. That is grand larceny." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The polished men in tailored suits behind my father suddenly scrambled to distance themselves. Lawyers whispered frantically to each other. This was no longer a civil dispute over a wealthy matriarch's estate. It was a massive, undeniable federal crime. My father looked at me, sheer panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Maya," he hissed, stepping toward me, "you don't understand what you're doing. You're destroying the family. You're destroying the company." I met his panicked gaze with absolute indifference. "The company is fine, Richard," I replied, using his first name for the first time in my life. "The pension funds have already been frozen and clawed back by the federal authorities. The only thing being destroyed today is you." Vanessa gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked from the judge to Richard, her eyes darting wildly, like an animal caught in a trap. The illusion of their invincibility was shattering in real time. The numbers were exact, the evidence was irrefutable. I had laid the trap with meticulous care, ensuring there was no legal loophole, no technicality, no manipulative lie that could save them. The federal grand jury had already convened. The warrants had already been signed. The audit was complete. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 federal marshals and 3 state bailiffs marched down the center aisle, their boots clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. They bypassed the gallery entirely and approached the plaintiff's table. Richard stumbled backward, bumping into the mahogany chair. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence evaporated. "Wait," he stammered, raising his hands. "There is a misunderstanding. I am the CEO. I have lawyers. We can settle this." The lead marshal didn't blink. Richard Henderson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. Vanessa watched as the marshals pulled Richard's arms behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs snapping shut was the loudest sound in the room. Then, survival instinct kicked in. Vanessa scrambled away from my father. I didn't know anything about it. She shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. He told me they were legitimate real estate investments. He controlled all the accounts. Richard is a tyrant. He forced me to sign those LLC documents. He manipulated me just like he manipulated Maya. I watched her throw the man she supposedly loved under the bus without a second of hesitation. Richard twisted his neck to stare at her, his face a mask of absolute betrayal and shock. "You treacherous liar," he spat. "We planned the restructuring together. It was your idea to hit the pension accounts. They turned on each other instantly, tearing each other apart to save themselves. It was the illusion of power of an empty wallet. They had walked into this courtroom believing they were untouchable elites, draped in designer suits and dripping in diamonds. But their entire identity was a rental, financed by stolen money. When you strip away the ill-gotten wealth, there is no character left, no loyalty, no intrinsic value. They were empty vessels, bankrupt of morality, collapsing the second their financial facade was removed. They didn't have power, they only had purchasing power. And now their accounts were frozen at zero. The marshals read them their rights, ignoring their screaming match. Vanessa sobbed as she was handcuffed, her mascara running down her cheeks, begging the judge for mercy. The judge looked at them with pure disgust. "Get them out of my courtroom," he ordered. I stood silently at the bench as my father and stepmother were escorted down the aisle. Richard looked back at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only the bitter realization that he had been outplayed by the daughter he deemed worthless. As the doors closed behind them, the courtroom fell dead silent again. The judge turned his attention back to me. "Miss Henderson," he said, his tone entirely different now, respectful and grave. "As the court-appointed forensic auditor and liaison for the federal receivership, you have full authorization to manage the estate and the corporation. What are your immediate intentions?" I squared my shoulders. "I am assuming total control of the company, Your Honor. My first priority is the complete restitution of the employee pension funds and the liquidation of all personal luxury assets acquired by the defendants." The balance sheet was finally clean. The liability had been removed. I was in control. The liquidation process was swift and clinical. Within 72 hours, Vanessa's luxury properties were seized and listed for sale. The private jet lease was terminated. The luxury cars, the offshore trusts, the vacation homes. I authorized the sale of every single asset they had acquired with stolen money. The funds were routed directly back into the employee pension accounts. Every worker received their retirement savings back in full, with interest calculated to cover the missing month. I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't seek gratitude. I simply executed the paperwork and watched the numbers turn from red back to black. It was a systematic restoration. True justice isn't merely about burning down the wicked. It is about rebuilding the foundation for those they harmed. Retaliation is focused on the past, on making the abuser pay. But the justice of the planter is focused on the future. It is the realization that the ultimate victory isn't their destruction. It is your creation. By liquidating their greed to restore the livelihood of 300 families, I had redefined the legacy of the Henderson name. It was no longer a symbol of exploitation. It was an instrument of restitution. A week later, I established the Eleanor Henderson Scholarship Foundation. I funded it with the remainder of my grandmother's personal estate. It was designed to provide full ride tuition for young women entering the fields of forensic accounting and corporate law. I wanted to build an army of auditors, women equipped with the knowledge and power to dismantle corrupt empires. A month after the courtroom collapse, I stood in the executive suite that used to belong to Richard. The room had been stripped of his ostentatious leather furniture, his expensive decanters, and his ego-driven artwork. It was now a functional, bright, and clean space. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Seattle skyline. I hadn't spoken to my father since the day he was led away in handcuffs. He was currently sitting in a federal detention center, awaiting a trial he could not afford to win. Vanessa had taken a plea deal, turning state's witness against him for a reduced sentence. They were destroying each other in court, just as they had destroyed everything else they touched. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent my entire life trying to balance an equation that was inherently flawed. I had thought that if I sacrificed enough, endured enough, and fixed enough of their mistakes, I would earn my place. I've come to realize that cutting toxic ties isn't an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You cannot negotiate your worth with people who profit from your insecurity. Sometimes you have to be willing to look at the people you love, audit their impact on your life, and accept the hard truth of the mathematics. If a relationship requires you to bankrupt your own soul just to keep them comfortable, it is a bad investment. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I didn't forgive my father for what he did, but I forgave myself for believing I deserved it. I turned away from the window and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop, pulled up the foundation's ledger, and got to work. The numbers were finally balanced. Have you ever had to walk away from a situation that was draining your soul? Share your story in the comments. We read every single one.